Behind the gilded portraits and ceremonial smiles of Britain's most famous family lies a lesser-known truth: struggles with dependency, obsession, and compulsion that shaped royal lives in ways the public rarely saw. Tonight, we're exploring the private battles of 35 royals who faced challenges behind palace doors. From substance dependencies to excessive habits, from compulsive behaviours that affected their health to obsessions that consumed their daily lives. These aren't the polished stories found in official histories. These are the human struggles that reveal royals as complex individuals facing very real difficulties. Before we explore this lesser-known side of royal history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, not just for more untold stories, but because understanding these struggles shows us the human side of even the most privileged lives. Feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. Number 1. King George IV. A life of unchecked excess. King George IV, who reigned from 1820 to 1830, became one of history's most cautionary examples of how unlimited privilege and lack of self-restraint can impact even the most powerful individuals. By the time he assumed the throne at age 57, George's health had deteriorated significantly, with contemporary accounts describing a man who weighed nearly 300 pounds and required specially constructed furniture to accommodate his size. These physical changes reflected decades of lifestyle choices that had concerned his physicians and advisors since his youth. Historical records indicate that George's relationship with food became increasingly problematic throughout his adult life. Court documents describe elaborate meals consumed at unusual hours, with quantities that shocked even those accustomed to royal dining customs. His chefs maintained constant readiness to prepare food, as George would request meals throughout the day and night. Medical historians note that this pattern of eating contributed significantly to the various health conditions that plagued his later years, including severe gout and mobility limitations. George's consumption of alcohol was similarly concerning to those around him. Contemporary observers documented regular drinking that began early in the day and continued through evening hours. He frequently combined alcohol with laudanum, an opium-based medicine that was commonly prescribed during this era for pain management and various ailments. While his physicians initially provided laudanum for legitimate medical complaints, historical accounts suggest that George's use gradually expanded beyond therapeutic purposes as his tolerance increased over time. The combination of these substances affected George's mental state and decision-making abilities. Court records indicate mood fluctuations and increasingly erratic behavior that concerned advisors and family members. His relationship with his wife, Queen Caroline, became so strained that he attempted to prevent her attendance at his own coronation, reflecting the personal toll that his lifestyle had taken on those closest to him. George's spending habits matched his other excesses, with massive expenditures on building projects and personal luxuries while Britain faced economic challenges. By his death in 1830 at age 67, medical professionals noted extensive internal damage from years of dietary excess. His reign had demonstrated how personal struggles with self-control, even among royalty, could diminish both health and public respect. George's story remains a historical example of dependency issues affecting individuals regardless of their status or resources, reminding us that privilege provides no immunity from the consequences of unchecked compulsive behaviours. Number 2. Prince George, Duke of Kent, a life kept secret. Prince George, Duke of Kent, fourth son of King George V, lived a life that palace officials worked desperately to keep hidden from public view during the 1920s and 30s. Born in 1902 into the strictest royal household of the modern era, George seemed an unlikely candidate for the struggles that would come to define much of his adult life. Yet behind the carefully maintained public image of a handsome, sophisticated prince lived someone grappling with dependencies that threatened both his health and the monarchy's reputation. Historical records that emerged decades after his death suggest that George became involved with cocaine use during his 20s, a period when he moved within London's most permissive social circles. While the substance was legal at the time, its use was increasingly frowned upon, particularly for a member of the royal family, where reputation and restraint were paramount. The situation represented a potential scandal that could not be allowed to become public knowledge. Contemporary accounts from friends and acquaintances describe changes in George's demeanour during this period, with episodes that alarmed those close to him. Palace officials and family members eventually intervened, deeply concerned about both George's well-being and the potential for public discovery. The intervention process was handled with absolute secrecy, involving trusted physicians and requiring George to spend time away from London's social scene. George's path toward recovery was significantly aided by his relationship with Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, whom he married in 1934. Marina provided stability and support that helped George address his struggles, and their marriage appeared to mark a genuine turning point in his life. Contemporary observers noted positive changes in his demeanour and reliability after the wedding, suggesting that the relationship offered him motivation and structure that had been lacking. The couple had 3 children and by most accounts built a happy family life, though George's earlier struggles remained closely guarded. He found purpose in his work with the Royal Air Force during World War II, serving in various capacities that gave him a sense of contribution beyond merely fulfilling ceremonial duties. George's life ended tragically in 1942 when he died in a plane crash in Scotland at age 39. Official investigations concluded it resulted from pilot error in poor weather conditions. His early death meant that the full story of his personal struggles remained largely unknown to the public for decades, only emerging gradually through historical research and released documents. His life serves as a reminder that dependency can affect anyone, regardless of privilege, and that recovery often requires strong support systems and genuine personal commitment. Number 3. King Edward VII, an insatiable appetite for pleasure. King Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 to 1910 after spending nearly 6 decades as heir to the throne, became known for lifestyle choices that concerned both his mother, Queen Victoria, and government officials throughout his adult life. His patterns of behaviour were so well established and openly practiced that they became almost expected aspects of his public persona, though the full extent of his various compulsions remained diplomatically understated during his lifetime. Edward's relationships with women extended far beyond what was considered acceptable, even by the relaxed standards of Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy. Historical records document dozens of affairs throughout his marriage to Princess Alexandra of Denmark, with mistresses ranging from aristocrats to actresses to society figures. He maintained these relationships simultaneously, rather than sequentially, requiring elaborate arrangements to manage schedules and maintain discretion. His pursuit of female companionship was so consuming that it influenced his daily routine, political decisions, and choice of social engagements. Food represented another area where Edward's appetites exceeded reasonable bounds. Contemporary accounts describe meals of staggering complexity and volume, often consisting of 12 or more courses consumed over several hours. He would eat 5 substantial meals daily, beginning with a large breakfast and continuing through late-night suppers. His weight increased significantly throughout his adult life, contributing to various health problems that his physicians repeatedly warned him about. Yet despite these warnings and his own discomfort, Edward seemed unable or unwilling to moderate his eating habits. Tobacco consumption was equally excessive. Edward smoked cigars constantly throughout the day, often going through a dozen or more in 24 hours, and also smoked cigarettes between cigars. The combination of heavy smoking and overeating contributed to respiratory problems and other health issues that worsened as he aged. His doctors advised him repeatedly to reduce both habits, but Edward dismissed these concerns, believing that pleasure in the moment outweighed potential future consequences. His approach to gambling reflected similar patterns of excess. He would wager large sums on horse races, card games, and virtually any activity that could be turned into a bet. While his wealth meant these losses rarely created financial hardship, the compulsive nature of his gambling concerned advisors who worried about the example it set and the possibility of scandal if his debts became too widely known. Edward's various compulsions ultimately affected his health significantly. He died in 1910 at age 68, after years of declining physical condition related directly to his lifestyle choices. His reign had been relatively brief, but marked by personal charm and diplomatic skill that made him popular despite his well-known indulgences. Historical assessments suggest that Edward's inability to moderate his various appetites may have shortened a life that, with more restraint, could have extended considerably longer, though whether he would have found such a restrained existence worth living remains an open question. Number 4. Princess Margaret. Smoke, spirits, and sorrow. Princess Margaret, younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, lived much of her life in her siblings' shadow while struggling with dependencies that became increasingly apparent to those around her. Born in 1930, Margaret seemed destined for a life of glamour and privilege, yet behind the carefully maintained public image of parties and sophistication lived someone grappling with compulsions that would significantly impact her health and well-being over the decades. Margaret's relationship with tobacco began in her teenage years and developed into a dependency that she maintained throughout most of her adult life. Contemporary observers noted that she was rarely seen without a cigarette in a holder, smoking continuously throughout the day. Historical accounts suggest she consumed cigarettes in exceptionally large quantities during certain periods, a habit that concerned family members and physicians alike. Despite repeated warnings about the health consequences and visible effects on her breathing and stamina, Margaret seemed unable or unwilling to stop for any sustained period. Alcohol consumption followed a similar pattern of escalation over the years, becoming a regular presence in her daily routine. What began as social drinking in her youth gradually increased to levels that friends and staff noticed with growing concern. Margaret would often begin drinking in the afternoon and continue through the evening. The combination of heavy smoking and drinking created a lifestyle that took an increasing toll on her physical health, though she maintained her social activities and public appearances with determined effort. Her struggles intensified after romantic disappointments, particularly the end of her relationship with Peter Townsend and the eventual breakdown of her marriage to Lord Snowdon. Historical biographers suggest that Margaret used substances partly as a coping mechanism for unhappiness and frustration with her position. She was royal enough to face constant scrutiny and restrictions, yet not senior enough to have clear purpose or significant responsibilities. This ambiguous position within the family structure may have contributed to her seeking comfort through means that ultimately harmed rather than helped. In her later years, Margaret's health declined significantly. She suffered multiple strokes beginning in the 1990s, and her mobility became increasingly limited. Medical professionals have noted that her decades of heavy smoking and drinking likely contributed substantially to these health crises. She also developed dependencies on pain medications prescribed for various ailments, adding another layer to her complex relationship with substances. Margaret died in 2002 at age 71, having spent her final years in declining health and increasing isolation. Her life serves as a poignant reminder that privilege and status provide no immunity from struggles that can affect anyone. Those close to her often reflected that beneath the glamorous exterior lived someone fundamentally unhappy, seeking relief through means that offered only temporary escape while creating long-term consequences. Number 5. King George VI, a habit that defined his reign. King George VI, who unexpectedly became king in 1936 after his brother's abdication, faced enormous pressures throughout his reign that included leading Britain through World War II and managing a severe speech impediment. Born in 1895 as Prince Albert, he developed a dependency on tobacco that began in his youth and continued with increasing intensity throughout his adult life, ultimately contributing significantly to his premature death. George began smoking as a young man, a common practice among his generation and social class. However, what started as casual habit gradually became a compulsion that he seemed unable to control, despite growing awareness of its effects on his health. Contemporary accounts indicate he smoked heavily throughout each day, often going through multiple packs. The stress of his unexpected kingship, combined with the tensions of wartime leadership and his ongoing struggle with stammering, appeared to intensify his reliance on cigarettes as a coping mechanism. His physicians noted the toll that smoking took on his health as early as his 40s. George suffered from various respiratory problems and circulatory issues that doctors directly linked to his tobacco use. Despite these warnings and his own recognition that smoking worsened his conditions, he found himself unable to quit for any meaningful period. Historical records suggest he made several attempts to reduce or stop smoking, but the combination of stress, habit, and physical dependency made sustained abstinence impossible for him. The situation became critical in his late 40s, when he developed serious arterial disease that required surgery and caused significant pain and mobility limitations. Medical professionals explicitly connected this condition to his years of heavy smoking, and they urged him to stop immediately. While George did attempt to reduce his consumption during this period, he could not eliminate it entirely, and the damage to his cardiovascular system had already been done. In 1951, George was diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease progressed rapidly despite medical interventions, and he died in February 1952 at age 56. His death shocked the nation and brought his daughter Elizabeth to the throne much earlier than anyone had anticipated. Medical historians have consistently identified his decades of heavy smoking as the primary factor in both his arterial disease and his lung cancer. George's struggle represents a common pattern where stress, duty, and personal habit combine to create dependencies that individuals recognize as harmful but find extremely difficult to overcome, even when facing life-threatening consequences. Number 6. Queen Anne, the weight of the crown. Queen Anne, who ruled from 1702 to 1714, faced physical challenges throughout her life that were compounded by patterns of consumption that contemporary observers noted with concern. Born in 1665, Anne experienced numerous health problems from childhood, including recurring illnesses and chronic pain that would plague her entire existence. Her approach to food and drink during her reign became subjects of court gossip and diplomatic correspondence, revealing struggles that modern understanding recognizes as potentially compulsive behaviors. Historical records indicate that Anne's relationship with food became increasingly problematic as she aged. Contemporary accounts describe someone who consumed large quantities of food regularly, with meals that grew more elaborate and excessive over time. Her weight increased dramatically during her years as queen, eventually making mobility difficult and contributing to joint problems that caused her significant pain. Court observers noted that she often ate beyond the point of comfort, suggesting patterns that went beyond mere enjoyment of good food. Anne's consumption of alcohol followed similar patterns. She favoured brandy and consumed it regularly throughout the day, not merely during formal meals or social occasions. Some contemporary accounts, though possibly exaggerated by political opponents, suggested she sometimes appeared affected by drink during official functions. Whether these observations were accurate or politically motivated slander remains debated by historians, but multiple sources from different perspectives mention her drinking with enough consistency to suggest it was notable, even by the standards of an era when alcohol consumption was commonplace. Her physical condition deteriorated significantly during her relatively brief reign. Anne suffered from gout, a painful condition that contemporary medicine did not fully understand, but that modern research has connected to both dietary habits and alcohol consumption. She also experienced dropsy, known today as edema, which caused severe swelling and discomfort. By her final years, she required assistance to walk and was often carried to official functions in a specially designed chair. The numerous pregnancies Anne endured, 17 in total with no surviving children beyond infancy, took an enormous toll on her body that her eating and drinking habits likely worsened. Each pregnancy loss added to her emotional burden and may have contributed to seeking comfort through consumption. Anne died in 1714 at age 49, having suffered a stroke. Her physicians noted her overall poor health and significant obesity as factors in her death. Her struggles illustrate how physical pain, emotional distress, and limited medical understanding in earlier eras could create cycles of behavior that modern perspectives recognize as potentially compulsive, though contemporaries simply viewed as personal weakness or lack of self-control. Number 7. King Henry VIII, the tyrant's transformation. King Henry VIII, who ruled England from 1509 to 1547, underwent a dramatic physical and psychological transformation during his reign that historians have connected to patterns of consumption that became increasingly uncontrolled in his later years. The young Henry, who ascended the throne at age 17, was athletic, handsome, and vigorous, standing over 6 feet tall and excelling at sports and physical activities. However, the Henry of his final decade had experienced significant physical changes, having gained substantial weight and suffering from numerous painful conditions. Historical records suggest that Henry's relationship with food changed significantly after a jousting accident in 1536 left him with a leg wound that never properly healed. The injury ended his active lifestyle and caused chronic pain that plagued him for the remaining 11 years of his life. Unable to exercise as he once had, but maintaining the same substantial appetite he had developed as an active young man, Henry's weight increased considerably. Contemporary accounts describe meals of notable size, with Henry consuming quantities that were remarkable even by the standards of lavish Tudor feasts. Medical historians examining historical records have noted that pain management in the Tudor era relied on various preparations, though documentation about Henry's specific treatments remains limited. His physicians would have had access to remedies available during that period, and court records suggest he received medical care for his chronic conditions. The extent and nature of these treatments, however, cannot be fully determined from surviving historical sources. His approach to food in his final decade appeared increasingly difficult to control. Court records indicate he would eat at irregular hours, demand elaborate meals at unexpected times, and continued consuming food even when experiencing discomfort. His size eventually became substantial enough to require specially constructed furniture and modified doorways throughout his residences. The leg ulcers that had troubled him since his jousting accident worsened, creating a cycle where pain led to immobility, immobility contributed to further weight gain, and increased weight caused additional physical difficulties. Henry died in January 1547, with contemporary accounts of his final years describing significant physical changes from his youth. His transformation serves as a historical example of how injury, pain, and loss of physical activity can contribute to patterns of consumption that significantly impact health, particularly when combined with unlimited access to food and the limited nutritional understanding available during the Tudor period. Number 8. King George III, when order becomes obsession. King George III, who ruled from 1760 to 1820, is perhaps best known for the mental health episodes that affected his later reign, but his private life throughout his years on the throne revealed patterns of behavior that modern observers might recognize as obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Born in 1738, George was raised with strict discipline and developed habits of routine and order that served him well initially, but eventually became so rigid and consuming that they interfered with his functioning and well-being. Historical accounts describe George's need for precise routine and exact repetition in his daily activities. He required meals served at specific times, prepared in particular ways, and would become distressed if schedules were disrupted even slightly. His insistence on routine extended to every aspect of palace life, with servants required to perform tasks in exact sequences and specific manners. What might have been merely preference for order appeared to cross into compulsion, as George seemed unable to deviate from established patterns, even when circumstances made flexibility appropriate or necessary. His collecting behaviours also suggested patterns that went beyond typical royal accumulation of possessions. George amassed substantial collections of books, scientific instruments, and various objects, but rather than simply enjoying these items, he appeared driven to catalogue, organise, and reorganise them constantly. He would spend hours arranging his collections according to systems that made sense primarily to him, becoming absorbed in these activities to the exclusion of other duties or leisure. During his episodes of mental disturbance, these tendencies intensified considerably. Historical records describe periods when George would repeat phrases extensively, appearing unable to stop himself despite recognizing the behavior as unusual. He would engage in repetitive physical actions, continue conversations well beyond reasonable duration, and focus on particular ideas or concerns with notable intensity. His physicians, working with limited understanding of mental health conditions, tried various treatments that ranged from ineffective to potentially harmful, unable to address the underlying factors affecting his behavior. George's later years were marked by permanent mental decline, with his son serving as Prince Regent from 1811 onward. The king lived in seclusion at Windsor Castle, where he experienced significant sensory and cognitive decline in his final decade. He died in 1820 at age 81. Modern medical historians examining historical records have proposed various possible explanations for George's condition, though definitive diagnosis remains impossible given the historical distance and limited medical documentation. Regardless of underlying causes, the patterns evident throughout his life suggest struggles with needs for control and order that became progressively more challenging to manage as he aged. Number 9. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Questions without answers. Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, and seemed destined to become king himself until his unexpected death from influenza in 1892 at age 28. His short life has been the subject of considerable historical discussion, with various accounts about his behaviour that remain difficult to verify with certainty. What is documented through historical records is that Eddie struggled with the expectations placed upon him, and that his family expressed concerns about his readiness for future responsibilities. Historical records confirm that Eddie faced academic challenges and appeared to lack the focus expected of someone in his position. His tutors and military instructors describe someone who seemed frequently distracted and unable to concentrate on tasks for sustained periods. Whether these difficulties stemmed from learning differences, lack of interest, or other factors remains a subject of historical analysis. His family worried about his preparation for future duties and took active interest in guiding his development. Contemporary documentation shows that Eddie's social circle during his time in London included individuals and venues that his family considered inappropriate for someone of his station. Historical biographers have examined these associations, though detailed documentation about specific activities remains limited. Much of what has been written about Eddie's private life relies on sources whose reliability varies considerably, making definitive conclusions about many aspects of his behaviour difficult for modern historians to establish. What historical records clearly demonstrate is that Eddie's family recognised concerns about his preparedness for future responsibilities. They made considerable efforts to provide structure and guidance, and arranged his engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, who would later marry his brother George after Eddie's death. This engagement was viewed partly as providing the stability and sense of purpose that might better prepare him for his eventual role. His sudden death from influenza during the 1891 to 1892 pandemic meant that questions about his fitness to rule were never tested by experience. His brother George, who became King George V, proved a capable and dutiful monarch, The numerous theories that emerged after Eddie's death reflect both the limited reliable documentation about his private life and the tendency of historical figures who die young to become subjects of ongoing discussion and reinterpretation. What remains clear from documented sources is a young man whose family had concerns about his development and took steps to provide guidance and structure, though the complete picture of his private life remains incomplete in the historical record. Number 10. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, the woman who became his world. Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne in 1936 after reigning for less than a year, demonstrated patterns of emotional attachment that historians have described as notably intense. Born in 1894 as the eldest son of King George V, Edward seemed initially prepared for kingship. Yet his relationship with Wallis Simpson revealed personality traits that made him willing to abandon duty, family, and country for a relationship that came to occupy a central position in his existence. Edward's attachment to Wallis went considerably beyond typical romantic devotion. Contemporary accounts from friends and staff describe someone who found separation from her difficult, who constantly sought her approval, and who allowed her considerable influence over his daily life. He would telephone her multiple times daily when apart, write lengthy letters, and become genuinely distressed when unable to make contact. This level of focus on the relationship concerned those around him, particularly as the constitutional questions about potential marriage became more pressing. After abdicating and marrying Wallis, Edward's emotional attachment remained notably strong. He had given up his position for her, which appeared to intensify his investment in the relationship's success. Friends who knew them as a couple reported that Edward seemed to defer to Wallis on most decisions, from personal matters to social arrangements. She had substantial input into what he wore, their social calendar, and household management. Rather than a partnership where both exercised equal influence, observers described dynamics where Edward appeared particularly eager to maintain her satisfaction. Historical records reveal that Edward's financial generosity toward Wallis was considerable. He provided jewellery, clothes, and gifts of substantial value, seemingly viewing her happiness as a primary concern. Even when financial circumstances became more constrained during their years living abroad, he continued significant expenditure on her comfort and desires. This pattern suggested that material expressions of devotion held important meaning within their relationship. His diaries and letters, examined by historians after his death, reveal someone who reflected frequently on his abdication decision and its consequences. He had made a choice that fundamentally altered his life course, and his writings suggest ongoing consideration of that decision's implications. Edward died in 1972 at age 77, having spent 35 years with Wallis after leaving the throne. His life illustrates how intense emotional focus on a single relationship can become the defining element of someone's existence, shaping decisions and life patterns in ways that have lasting consequences for personal identity and sense of purpose. Number 11. King Charles II, a reign of romantic pursuit. King Charles II, who ruled from 1660 to 1685 after the restoration of the monarchy, became known for patterns of romantic involvement that were remarkable even by the standards of 17th century royalty. Born in 1630, Charles spent his youth in exile during the English Civil War and Commonwealth period, experiences that shaped his approach to life once he reclaimed the throne. His reign was marked by considerable personal freedom in matters of romance, with contemporary accounts documenting numerous relationships that occupied significant amounts of his time and attention. Historical records confirm that Charles maintained multiple simultaneous relationships throughout his reign, openly acknowledging many of them rather than attempting discretion. He fathered at least 12 illegitimate children with various partners, all of whom he recognized and supported financially. His official mistresses included notable figures such as Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwyn, and Louise de Querouaille. women who wielded considerable influence at court and received titles, properties, and substantial financial support. The openness of these arrangements was unusual even for an era when royal infidelity was common, but typically conducted with more discretion. Charles's pursuit of romantic involvement appeared to occupy a central place in his daily life and priorities. Contemporary observers noted that he would spend hours each day visiting his various romantic interests, often neglecting governmental affairs to do so. His ministers sometimes struggled to secure his attention for matters of state, as Charles's personal interests frequently took precedence over administrative duties. This pattern of prioritizing romantic pursuits over other responsibilities created challenges for those attempting to manage the practical business of governing. The financial cost of maintaining multiple households and supporting numerous children and their mothers was substantial. Charles spent enormous sums on gifts, properties, and ongoing support for his romantic partners and their offspring. These expenditures sometimes created tensions with Parliament, which had to approve funds for royal expenses and occasionally objected to what they viewed as excessive personal spending. The king's generosity toward his romantic interests appeared largely unlimited, suggesting that these relationships held significance beyond mere physical attraction. His wife, Catherine of Braganza, endured these arrangements with dignity but considerable personal pain. She produced no heirs, which made the situation more difficult as Charles's illegitimate children thrived while the legitimate royal line remained uncertain. Catherine's position at court was often awkward, as she had to navigate an environment where her husband's other relationships were openly acknowledged and his romantic partners wielded influence and received honours. Charles died in 1685 at age 54, reportedly apologising on his deathbed for being an unconscionable time dying. His brother James inherited the throne, beginning a succession that would soon face its own crises. Charles's pattern of romantic involvement throughout his reign demonstrated how personal pursuits can become consuming enough to affect governance and create lasting consequences for both individuals involved and the institutions they serve. Number 12. Queen Victoria, Collections of Memory and Mourning. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, the longest reign in British history until her great-great-granddaughter Elizabeth II surpassed it, developed patterns of behaviour after her husband's death that historians have described as obsessive mourning. Born in 1819, Victoria had a happy marriage to Prince Albert that was cut tragically short when he died of typhoid fever in 1861 at age 42. Her response to this loss shaped the remaining 40 years of her reign and revealed tendencies toward fixation and repetitive behaviours that went far beyond typical grieving. Historical records document Victoria's immediate response to Albert's death as one of complete devastation. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, wearing black mourning clothes exclusively for the rest of her life, and insisting that the entire court maintain perpetual mourning as well. This extended mourning period, which continued for decades rather than the customary year or two, created a sombre atmosphere throughout the royal household that affected everyone connected to the court. Victoria's treatment of Albert's rooms and possessions revealed particularly intense patterns of preservation. She ordered that his private apartments be maintained exactly as they were on the day he died, with fresh clothing laid out daily, hot water brought for shaving each morning, and nothing moved or changed. She would visit these rooms regularly, speaking to Albert as though he were present and consulting him on decisions. This practice continued for the remaining 40 years of her life, creating what was essentially a shrine that staff members had to maintain with exact precision. Her collection of items related to Albert expanded dramatically after his death. She commissioned hundreds of busts, statues, paintings, and photographs of him, which were displayed throughout all her residences. She established the Albert Memorial in London and numerous other monuments to his memory. The amount of resources, time, and emotional energy devoted to commemorating Albert went far beyond typical memorial practices, suggesting patterns of fixation that interfered with her ability to engage fully with present circumstances. Victoria's eating patterns also changed significantly after Albert's death, with historical accounts suggesting she turned to food for comfort during her grief. Her weight increased substantially during her years of mourning, and she developed preferences for rich foods and large portions that concerned her physicians. While not as extreme as some other royals' relationships with food, the change in her eating habits appeared connected to emotional distress and seeking comfort through consumption. Her eventual emergence from complete seclusion came gradually and was never complete. Victoria resumed some public duties, but maintained her mourning practices and her devotion to Albert's memory until her own death in 1901 at age 81. Her 40-year period of intense mourning affected not just her own life, but shaped the tone of the entire Victorian era, creating associations between her reign and solemnity that might have been quite different had Albert lived. Her patterns of preservation and commemoration illustrate how grief, when not adequately processed, can develop into behaviours that consume decades of life and prevent full engagement with the present. Number 13. Prince Harry. A Prince's Private Struggles. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, second son of King Charles III and Princess Diana, has spoken publicly in recent years about struggles during his youth that he kept hidden from public view at the time. Born in 1984, Harry grew up under intense media scrutiny that intensified dramatically after his mother's death in 1997, when he was just 12 years old. The trauma of losing his mother in such public circumstances, combined with the pressures of royal life, contributed to difficulties during his teenage and early adult years that he has since discussed openly. In his autobiography and various interviews, Harry has acknowledged that during his late teens and 20s, he used substances including alcohol and marijuana as coping mechanisms for unresolved grief and emotional pain. He has described this period as one where he was struggling to process his mother's death, while simultaneously trying to fulfill royal duties and manage constant media attention. Historical accounts from people close to him during this time suggest that his behaviour occasionally caused concern among family members and palace staff, though much of this remained private at the time. Harry's acknowledged use of substances during this period appears to have been part of broader struggles with his mental health and his role within the royal family. He has spoken about experiencing anxiety and feeling trapped by expectations and duties that he found increasingly difficult to manage. The combination of unresolved trauma, intense public scrutiny, and the constraints of royal life created circumstances where he sought relief through means that provided temporary escape but did not address underlying issues. His military service, particularly his deployments to Afghanistan, provided structure and purpose that appeared to help during this period. Harry has described his time in the military as when he felt most himself, able to be treated as Captain Wales rather than Prince Harry. The focus and sense of mission that military service provided seemed to offer healthier outlets for his energy and emotions than the party lifestyle he had engaged in previously. Harry's path toward addressing these struggles more constructively came through therapy, which he began years before publicly discussing it. He has spoken about the importance of professional help in processing his grief over his mother's death and developing healthier coping strategies. His openness about seeking mental health support has been notable as it breaks with traditional royal reluctance to discuss such matters publicly. His decision to step back from royal duties in 2020 and move to California with his wife Meghan represented another significant change in his approach to managing the pressures he had struggled with for years. Whether this geographical and institutional distance will provide the peace and stability he seeks remains an ongoing story. Harry's willingness to discuss his past struggles publicly, while controversial within some circles, reflects a modern approach to mental health and addiction issues that emphasizes openness over secrecy and professional help over silent suffering. Struggles publicly, while controversial within some circles, reflects a modern approach to mental health and addiction issues that emphasizes openness over secrecy and professional help over silent suffering. Number 14. Princess Anne, daughter of George II, the Gambler Princess. Princess Anne, daughter of King George II and Queen Caroline, lived from 1709 to 1759 and became known during her lifetime for a relationship with gambling that concerned even those accustomed to the wagering culture of 18th century aristocracy. Born into the highest levels of British society, Anne had access to considerable wealth and moved in circles where gambling was a common social activity. However, her involvement with games of chance appeared to exceed typical aristocratic pastimes and developed into patterns that created both financial and social difficulties. Historical records from the Georgian court document that Anne spent significant portions of her time at card tables, participating in games where substantial sums of money changed hands. Contemporary accounts describe someone who would play for hours, often late into the night, and who appeared unable to walk away from games even when losing consistently. The amounts she wagered were notable even among wealthy aristocrats, and her losses occasionally required financial assistance from family members to resolve. The social culture of the time viewed gambling as acceptable aristocratic entertainment, but even within this permissive context, Anne's behaviour drew comment and concern. Court observers noted that she seemed preoccupied with gaming, structuring her social calendar around opportunities to play and becoming visibly distressed when prevented from wagering. Her focus on gambling appeared to interfere with other aspects of her life, including family relationships and social obligations that didn't involve games of chance. Anne's financial situation became strained by her gambling losses, despite her considerable income and resources. She accumulated debts that required periodic settlement, creating awkward situations where family members had to intervene to prevent public scandal. The pattern of wagering beyond her means losing substantial sums, requiring bailout, and then returning to the same behaviours suggested difficulty controlling the impulse to gamble, regardless of rational understanding of the consequences. Her relationships within the royal family were affected by her gambling habits. Her father, George II, expressed frustration with her behaviour and the financial problems it created. Family gatherings sometimes became tense, as relatives attempted to discourage her from excessive wagering or dealt with the aftermath of her losses. Despite these interventions and her own apparent awareness that her gambling was problematic, Anne continued the patterns throughout much of her adult life. Anne died in 1759 at age 49, having never married. Her life illustrates how gambling, even in an era when it was socially acceptable, could develop into compulsive behaviour that created ongoing difficulties. The Georgian era's permissive attitude toward wagering meant that problematic gambling often went unrecognised as such, viewed instead as merely unfortunate luck or poor judgment, rather than a pattern requiring intervention. Anne's struggles remained largely within family knowledge during her lifetime, but historical records reveal someone whose relationship with gambling went beyond recreational activity into territory that affected her financial stability and personal relationships. Number 15. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, Debts and Desperation. Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, second son of King George III, lived from 1763 to 1827 and became notorious for gambling habits that created financial crises throughout his adult life. Born into royalty with substantial income from his position, Frederick nevertheless managed to accumulate debts of staggering proportions through compulsive wagering that he seemed unable to control despite repeated consequences and interventions. Historical records document that Frederick would bet on virtually anything: card games, horse races, sporting events, and even trivial matters that could be turned into wagers. His gambling wasn't occasional entertainment, but a daily activity that consumed both his time and his resources. Contemporary accounts describe someone who appeared unable to resist opportunities to gamble, regardless of his current financial situation or previous losses. The amounts he wagered were substantial, often far exceeding what even his generous royal income could support. The debts Frederick accumulated became a recurring political problem. Parliament had to periodically address the situation, as the Duke's creditors would eventually demand payment, and the potential for public scandal required resolution. These bailouts created political controversy, with some members of Parliament objecting to using public funds to rescue a prince from the consequences of his own poor judgment and lack of self-control. Each time Frederick received financial assistance to settle his debts, he would promise to reform his behaviour, only to return to gambling and accumulate new debts within months. His military career, where he served as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, was complicated by his financial situation. Frederick implemented important military reforms and demonstrated genuine administrative ability, but his gambling and debts created vulnerabilities that others could exploit. The scandal involving Mary Ann Clark, who sold military commissions and promotions using her influence with Frederick, emerged partly because his constant need for money made him susceptible to manipulation and poor judgment in his personal relationships. The psychological aspects of Frederick's gambling suggested compulsive behaviour rather than merely poor money management. He would continue playing even when winning, unable to walk away while ahead, inevitably gambling until he lost everything and more. He appeared to experience genuine distress about his debts and their consequences, yet could not sustain any meaningful change in his behaviour. This pattern of awareness, remorse, resolution, and relapse is characteristic of compulsive gambling that goes beyond recreational wagering into territory where the activity controls the person, rather than the person controlling the activity. Frederick died in 1827 at age 63, still heavily in debt, despite a lifetime of substantial royal income. His lack of legitimate heirs meant his title became extinct at his death, and the succession passed to his younger brother, who eventually became King William IV. Frederick's life serves as a historical example of how gambling can become a compulsion that even royal status, considerable wealth, and repeated interventions cannot resolve without the individual developing genuine ability to control the behaviour, something Frederick apparently never achieved, despite decades of consequences that should have provided powerful motivation to change. Number 16. Queen Mary, consort to King George V, the acquisitive Queen. Queen Mary, wife of King George V and grandmother to Queen Elizabeth II, lived from 1867 to 1953 and became known for collecting habits that went far beyond typical royal accumulation of art and antiques. Born as Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, she grew up in aristocratic but financially strained circumstances that may have contributed to her later relationship with possessions. Once she married into the wealthiest royal family in the world, her collecting took on patterns that those around her found increasingly difficult to manage. Historical accounts describe Mary's approach to acquiring objects as going beyond normal appreciation for beautiful or valuable items. When visiting stately homes or viewing private collections, she would admire pieces with such obvious desire that owners felt socially obligated to offer them as gifts. Refusing a queen's expressed interest in an object was nearly impossible without causing offence, creating situations where Mary's admiration functioned almost as a demand. While not quite theft, this practice exploited social conventions and her royal position in ways that made many uncomfortable. The scope of Mary's collections was enormous, filling multiple rooms at various royal residences. She collected jewellery with particular intensity, acquiring pieces constantly and having them reset and recombined in endless variations. She also accumulated furniture, paintings, decorative objects, china, and virtually anything that caught her interest. The organisation and cataloguing of these collections became a substantial undertaking, requiring staff and resources to maintain the detailed records Mary insisted upon. Her need to acquire and possess objects appeared compulsive, rather than merely enthusiastic collecting. She would spend hours examining her possessions, reorganising them, and planning new acquisitions. The time and mental energy devoted to her collections sometimes seemed to take precedence over other aspects of her life and duties. Staff members noted that Mary's mood would improve noticeably when acquiring new items, and that she experienced genuine distress if she desired something but couldn't obtain it. The financial aspect of Mary's collecting was complex. As queen, she had access to substantial resources, but her acquisitions still represented significant expenditure. More problematically, her practice of essentially compelling gifts from subjects created ethical questions about the appropriate use of royal position. People who couldn't easily afford to part with valuable items found themselves in difficult positions when the Queen expressed interest in their possessions. Mary's collecting continued throughout her life, with the accumulation of objects becoming one of her defining characteristics. When she died in 1953, the task of inventorying and organizing her collections took considerable time and effort. Many items were incorporated into the royal collection, while others were distributed among family members. Her granddaughter Elizabeth inherited substantial jewellery that Mary had accumulated over decades. Queen Mary's life illustrates how collecting can become compulsive, driven by needs for acquisition and possession that go beyond aesthetic appreciation or investment value into territory where obtaining and organising objects becomes a central focus of daily life and emotional well-being. Number 17. King George V, Stamps and Obsessive Order. King George V, who reigned from 1910 to 1936, developed a relationship with stamp collecting that went far beyond casual hobby into territory that those around him recognised as obsessive dedication. Born in 1865 as the second son of King Edward VII, George had not expected to become king and had pursued a naval career that instilled in him a love of order, precision, and routine. These tendencies found expression in his approach to philately, which became one of his life's consuming passions. George's stamp collection was among the finest in the world, personally assembled and maintained with meticulous attention to detail. He would spend hours each day examining stamps through magnifying glasses, cataloguing new acquisitions, and studying variations in printing, paper, and perforation that most people would never notice. This wasn't casual appreciation of an interesting hobby. George possessed genuine expertise and could identify rare variations and detect forgeries with skill that impressed professional philatelists. His knowledge was encyclopedic, and he maintained detailed records of every item in his collection. The time George devoted to his stamps sometimes concerned those around him, as it competed with his governmental duties and family relationships. He would retreat to his study to work on his collection for extended periods, becoming so absorbed that he was difficult to interrupt, even for important matters. Staff members learned to schedule around his stamp time, recognizing that attempting to engage him during these sessions often resulted in irritation and distraction. The collection represented a space where George exercised complete control, a refuge from the pressures and compromises of kingship. His expenditure on stamps was substantial, though not financially problematic given his resources. George would purchase rare items at auction, commission agents to search for specific stamps, and correspond with collectors worldwide to arrange trades and acquisitions. The collection's value increased enormously during his lifetime, eventually becoming one of the world's most significant philatelic holdings. However, the motivation seemed less about investment than about the satisfaction of completion, organization, and possession. George's rigidity about his collection extended to its physical organization and care. Everything had to be arranged according to his specific system, and he would become genuinely upset if items were disturbed or misfiled. This need for exact order in his collection reflected broader personality traits. George was a man who valued routine, discipline, and precision in all aspects of life. The stamps provided an outlet for these tendencies, allowing him to create and maintain perfect order in at least one domain of his existence. He continued working on his collection until shortly before his death in 1936. The stamps passed to his son Edward, who sold portions of it, and eventually to George VI and then Elizabeth II. The collection remains an important part of the royal holdings today. George's dedication to philately illustrates how hobbies can become obsessive pursuits that provide meaning and satisfaction, but also consume time and mental energy in ways that can border on compulsive, particularly for individuals whose personalities incline toward order, control, and systematic completion. Number 18. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The workaholic prince. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and consort to Queen Elizabeth II, lived from 1921 to 2021 and demonstrated throughout his adult life patterns of work that those close to him described as compulsive dedication that often came at the expense of personal relationships and well-being. Born into Greek and Danish royalty, but raised in circumstances of relative instability and financial constraint, Philip developed an approach to duty and work that defined much of his identity and shaped his decades as the Queen's husband. Philip's schedule throughout his years as consort was notoriously demanding, often exceeding what seemed necessary or healthy. He maintained hundreds of patronages and attended countless engagements annually, approaching each with the same intensity and preparation. He would work through briefings late into the night, insisting on being thoroughly informed about every organization and issue he engaged with. This dedication to preparation and thorough understanding was admirable, but the hours he devoted suggested difficulty setting reasonable boundaries or allowing himself rest. His need to remain productive and useful appeared to stem partly from the challenging nature of his position. As the Queen's husband, Philip had no constitutional role and had to create purpose and identity for himself within constraints that would have frustrated many people. Rather than retreat into leisure, he threw himself into work with an intensity that sometimes seemed driven by need to prove his value and relevance. Friends noted that Philip appeared uncomfortable with idleness and would quickly become restless during any enforced inactivity. The toll this work intensity took on family relationships has been acknowledged by his children. Philip's demanding schedule meant he was often absent, and when present, he sometimes seemed preoccupied with the next engagement or responsibility. His children have described a father who struggled to express affection and whose primary interaction mode involved duty and expectation rather than emotional connection. While he loved his family, his work patterns created distance that affected these relationships throughout his life. Philip's various projects and initiatives reflected his need to remain constantly engaged. He founded the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, worked extensively on conservation issues, and involved himself in numerous other causes. These weren't merely ceremonial patronages. Philip engaged substantively with issues and demanded results from organizations he supported. His drive to make meaningful contributions was admirable, but the breadth and intensity of his commitments suggested difficulty choosing priorities or accepting limitations. Even in his later years, Philip resisted reducing his workload, continuing to fulfill engagements well into his 90s. His eventual retirement from public duties at age 96 came reluctantly, and those close to him noted that he struggled with the loss of structure and purpose that his work had provided. He died in 2021 at age 99, having maintained active engagement with various interests until his final months. Philip's life illustrates how work can become an identity and a compulsion, providing meaning and purpose, but also potentially preventing fuller engagement with relationships and rest. His dedication was admirable, yet it came with costs that he and those around him experienced throughout his long life. Number 19. King William IV, the Sailor King's Indulgences. King William IV, who ruled from 1830 to 1837, lived a life marked by naval service and personal habits that reflected the culture of the British Navy during the late 18th century. Born in 1765 as the third son of King George III, William never expected to become king and spent his formative years at sea, where he developed patterns of behaviour common among naval officers, but somewhat unusual for royalty. William's years in the Navy exposed him to heavy drinking culture that was standard among sailors and officers. Historical accounts indicate that he developed a taste for alcohol during these years that he maintained throughout his life. While not necessarily excessive by naval standards, it was notable enough that contemporaries mentioned it regularly. He would consume substantial quantities of wine and spirits, particularly during social occasions, and appeared most comfortable in environments where drinking was central to the gathering. His relationship with Dorothy Jordan, an actress with whom he lived for 20 years and had 10 children, reflected his tendency toward arrangements that shocked proper society. William lived openly with Jordan in a situation that would have been unthinkable for his more status-conscious brothers, demonstrating relative indifference to social judgment and prioritizing personal satisfaction over conventional royal behavior. William's eating habits were hearty and excessive, typical of naval culture where food was consumed enthusiastically when available. He maintained this approach throughout his life, with meals that were substantial in both quantity and richness. His weight increased considerably over the years, and by the time he became king at age 64, he was notably corpulent. His approach to food appeared to be one of enthusiastic indulgence rather than moderation. His ascension to the throne came unexpectedly after the death of his brother George IV. William's 7-year reign was marked by significant political changes, including the Reform Act of 1832, but his personal habits remained relatively unchanged. He was more accessible and informal than his predecessors, sometimes to the dismay of court officials who found his manners too casual for royal dignity. William's health declined significantly during his reign, with his years of heavy eating and drinking taking their toll. He suffered from various ailments related to his lifestyle, including respiratory and circulatory problems. He died in June 1837 at age 71. His reign had been brief and somewhat accidental, but it served as a bridge between George IV and the Victorian era. William's life illustrates how patterns of consumption formed in youth, particularly in environments where such habits were normalized, can persist throughout life even when circumstances change dramatically, making him an unusual monarch more comfortable with informal company than elaborate court ceremony. Number 20. Princess Louise, daughter of Queen Victoria, art as escape. Princess Louise, fourth daughter of Queen Victoria, lived from 1848 to 1939 and developed a relationship with artistic work that went beyond typical royal patronage into territory that those around her recognized as intense dedication, bordering on obsession. Born into the rigid Victorian court where her mother's expectations and control dominated every aspect of life, Louise found in sculpture and painting an outlet for creative energy and a form of escape from the suffocating constraints of her position. Louise's commitment to sculpture was genuinely professional rather than merely dilettante. She studied at the National Art Training School, working alongside professional artists and receiving serious instruction in technique and theory. She maintained a working studio where she would spend hours daily, often emerging covered in clay or plaster dust, completely absorbed in her projects. This level of dedication was unusual for Victorian royal women, who were expected to pursue genteel accomplishments rather than serious artistic careers. The intensity of Louise's focus on her art sometimes concerned family members who felt she neglected social obligations and family duties in favor of her studio work. She would become so absorbed in projects that she was difficult to interrupt, losing track of time and missing scheduled engagements. Her mother, Victoria, viewed Louise's artistic ambitions with mixed feelings, proud of her daughter's talent, but uncomfortable with the professional seriousness Louise brought to her work, which seemed to cross boundaries of what was considered appropriate for her station. Louise's public sculptures, including monuments that still stand today, demonstrated genuine skill that went beyond what royal privilege might have excused. She created the statue of Queen Victoria that sits outside Kensington Palace, a work that required technical expertise and artistic vision. The satisfaction Louise derived from completing such projects appeared to provide meaning and identity that her role as Victorian princess could not offer, suggesting that art filled emotional needs beyond mere creative expression. Her marriage to the Marquis of Lorne provided some escape from court life, but was reportedly unconsummated and likely arranged partly to give her more freedom to pursue her artistic interests. The marriage allowed Louise to maintain separate residences and schedules, creating space for the intensive studio work that defined much of her adult life. She continued working on sculpture and painting well into her later years, maintaining her artistic practice as a central organizing principle of her existence. Louise's dedication to her art reflected broader struggles with the limitations placed on Victorian royal women. Her creative work provided an acceptable channel for energies and ambitions that had few other outlets in her constrained world. The hours she spent in her studio represented both escape from and resistance to expectations that would have confined her to purely ceremonial existence. She died in 1939 at age 91, having maintained her artistic practice almost until the end. Her life illustrates how creative work can become not merely a hobby, but a consuming focus that provides identity, purpose, and psychological sustenance, particularly for individuals whose other life circumstances offer limited opportunities for meaningful self-expression and accomplishment. Number 21. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, Pain and its Management. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, an eighth child of Queen Victoria, lived from 1853 to 1884 and faced a lifetime of physical suffering due to haemophilia, the genetic bleeding disorder that Victoria unknowingly passed to several descendants. His experience with pain management during the Victorian era illustrates the challenges of managing chronic conditions with the limited medical resources available during that period. Historical records indicate that Leopold experienced frequent painful bleeding episodes from earliest childhood. Even minor injuries could trigger internal bleeding that caused severe pain lasting days or weeks. Falls that wouldn't harm other children could threaten Leopold's life, creating a childhood marked by caution, restriction, and recurring episodes of suffering. Victorian medicine had limited understanding of haemophilia and no effective treatments beyond rest and waiting for bleeding to stop naturally. Physicians treating Leopold used laudanum, the standard pain medication prescribed during the Victorian era for painful conditions. This was considered appropriate medical practice at the time, and doctors prescribed it routinely for patients experiencing chronic pain. For someone with Leopold's condition, such pain management would have been viewed as medically necessary, as Victorian medicine had few alternative treatments to offer patients suffering from severe ongoing pain. Leopold's determination to live as normally as possible despite his condition was remarkable. He attended Oxford University, an unusual decision for any prince, and especially for one with serious health challenges. He pursued intellectual interests, formed friendships, and eventually married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont, who accepted both Leopold and the difficulties his condition presented. His refusal to let haemophilia completely define or limit his life demonstrated considerable courage. He maintained active intellectual engagement despite frequent periods of illness and recovery. Leopold was interested in the arts and literature, using his education and natural intelligence to create meaningful existence beyond the physical limitations his condition imposed. His marriage produced 2 children, though he would not live to see them grow up. Leopold's death at age 30 in 1884 came after a fall in Cannes, France. He slipped, hit his head, and suffered a fatal brain hemorrhage, the death his family had feared throughout his life. He left behind a pregnant wife and young daughter, both of whom would carry the haemophilia gene to future generations, including eventually to the Russian imperial family through his daughter's descendants. Leopold's experience reflects the limited options available to individuals with chronic painful conditions during the Victorian era. Medical science had not yet developed the understanding or treatments that would later become available, leaving physicians and patients to manage severe ongoing pain with the limited tools at their disposal. His life demonstrates the challenges faced by those suffering chronic conditions in periods when medicine could offer relief but had incomplete understanding of long-term management, and when patients had to balance quality of life against the constraints imposed by both their conditions and the era's limited medical capabilities. Number 22. Queen Elizabeth II, the turf, and the breed. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned from 1952 to 2022, the longest reigning British monarch in history, maintained throughout her life a relationship with horse racing and breeding that those close to her recognized as far more than casual royal interest. Born in 1926, Elizabeth developed her passion for horses in childhood and sustained it with remarkable intensity for over 90 years, creating what amounted to a parallel career alongside her constitutional duties. Elizabeth's knowledge of horse bloodlines, breeding strategies, and racing form was encyclopedic and genuinely expert. She could discuss pedigrees going back generations, understood the genetics of breeding for specific traits, and made breeding decisions herself rather than merely approving recommendations from advisors. Racing professionals who interacted with her were consistently impressed by the depth and currency of her knowledge, noting that she stayed informed about developments in the field and engaged in discussions at a technical level that went far beyond what politeness required. The time Elizabeth devoted to her racing and breeding interests was substantial. She would study racing forms daily, watch races whenever possible, and spend considerable time reviewing breeding plans and evaluating horses. Staff members noted that discussing her horses was one of the few topics that would reliably engage her full enthusiasm and animation, revealing a side of her personality that formal duties rarely allowed to show. The Racing Post was essential daily reading, reviewed with the same attention she gave to government papers. Her emotional investment in her horse's performance was genuine and sometimes visible. While Elizabeth maintained remarkable composure during most public appearances, those close to her could see her excitement when her horses won and her disappointment when they lost. These races mattered to her in ways that went beyond the financial stakes or prestige involved, suggesting deep personal connection to this aspect of her life that existed separately from her royal identity. The success of her breeding program was substantial, with numerous winning horses produced from her bloodstock over decades. This wasn't merely luck or the advantage of unlimited resources. Elizabeth's program succeeded because of her knowledge, judgment, and genuine engagement with every aspect of the breeding and racing process. She made real contributions to British racing beyond her role as wealthy patron, earning respect within the industry based on merit rather than merely position. Her passion for horses provided emotional sustenance and continuity throughout a life of enormous change and pressure. The horses represented something that was genuinely hers, pursued for love of the activity rather than duty or obligation. While calling this an addiction would be inappropriate, the intensity and centrality of this interest in her life, maintained consistently for over 9 decades, despite all other demands on her time and attention, suggests it fulfilled needs and provided satisfactions that nothing else quite matched. Elizabeth died in September 2022 at age 96, having maintained active interest in her horses almost until the end. Her relationship with racing and breeding illustrates how passionate interests, even healthy ones, can become defining all elements of identity and crucial sources of joy and meaning that sustain individuals through the challenges and constraints of demanding lives. Number 23. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, military memorabilia and rigid routine. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, third son of Queen Victoria, lived from 1850 to 1942 and developed patterns of collecting and routine that defined much of his long life. Born into the Victorian royal family, but pursuing a genuine military career rather than merely ceremonial service, Arthur found in military life the structure, purpose, and identity that shaped his personality and habits for over 9 decades. Arthur's military career was substantive and active, spanning decades of service in various capacities across the British Empire. He rose to the rank of Field Marshal and took his duties with utmost seriousness, approaching soldiering with dedication that earned respect from career military men who might otherwise have dismissed him as a royal dilettante. This professional military experience instilled in Arthur habits of precision, order, and routine that he maintained throughout his extremely long life. His collection of military memorabilia was extensive and meticulously organized. Weapons, uniforms, medals, and documents from his career filled rooms at his residences, each item catalogued and displayed according to systems that Arthur personally maintained. He would spend hours reviewing these collections, recounting campaigns and battles to anyone willing to listen, reliving his military experiences through the physical objects he had preserved. The collection represented not merely nostalgia, but a way of maintaining connection to the identity and purpose that military service had provided. Arthur's daily routine was governed by military precision throughout his life. He rose at specific times, took meals on rigid schedules, and structured his days with the discipline of a soldier on campaign. This wasn't flexibility. Arthur believed that order and routine were morally superior to chaos and spontaneity, and he expected those around him to maintain similar standards. Staff members found him predictable and exacting, someone who noticed and commented on any deviation from established patterns. His approach to royal duties reflected the same military mindset. Arthur fulfilled his obligations with conscientious attention to detail and protocol, viewing ceremonial functions as duties to be executed properly rather than opportunities for personal expression or innovation. He maintained standards and expected others to do likewise, becoming increasingly uncomfortable with what he viewed as declining standards as the 20th century progressed, and social norms became more relaxed. Arthur's remarkable longevity meant he outlived most of his siblings and witnessed enormous changes in British society, military practice, and royal life. He continued maintaining his collections and routines well into his 90s, finding comfort in the familiar patterns, even as the world around him transformed beyond recognition. He died in 1942 at age 91, having maintained his military bearing and rigid habits almost until the end. His life illustrates how structures and routines that provide purpose and identity during active careers can become defining characteristics that individuals maintain long after the original context has passed, providing continuity and meaning, even when their practical relevance has diminished. Number 24, Princess Beatrice of the United Kingdom, A Daughter's Devotion. Princess Beatrice, youngest daughter and last surviving child of Queen Victoria, lived from 1857 to 1944 and developed patterns of dependency on her mother that defined much of her existence. Born when Victoria was already an established monarch, Beatrice grew up in the intense atmosphere of the Victorian court, where her mother's needs and expectations shaped every aspect of daily life. This environment created dynamics that resulted in Beatrice spending most of her life in her mother's shadow, her own identity substantially subordinated to her role as Victoria's companion and support. Historical records indicate that Victoria decided early on that Beatrice would remain at home as her mother's permanent companion, never marrying and leaving. This expectation was communicated clearly to Beatrice, who internalized it and structured her own expectations accordingly. She served as Victoria's secretary, companion, and emotional support, functions that consumed her time and energy while providing little space for independent development or separate identity. When Beatrice fell in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg and wished to marry, Victoria initially opposed the match strongly, unable to bear the thought of losing her indispensable daughter. The compromise reached was that Henry and Beatrice would live with Victoria at court, ensuring Beatrice remained available for her mother's needs. This arrangement satisfied Victoria, but meant that Beatrice never established truly independent household or life separate from her mother's overwhelming presence and demands. Beatrice's devotion to her mother extended beyond Victoria's death in 1901. She was tasked with transcribing and editing Victoria's extensive journals, a process that took 30 years and involved Beatrice destroying the original volumes as she worked, keeping only edited versions she deemed appropriate. This enormous undertaking consumed decades of Beatrice's widowhood, representing continued service to her mother's memory and legacy long after Victoria's death had technically freed her from obligation. The psychological cost of this lifelong dependency and subordination is difficult to assess from historical records, but Beatrice's life suggests someone whose individual identity was substantially absorbed into her role as Victoria's daughter and servant. She had interests and relationships of her own, but these existed within the framework of her primary function as her mother's support. The extent to which Beatrice chose this role versus had it imposed upon her remains debated by historians examining her life. Her own widowhood came early when Henry died in 1896, leaving Beatrice to raise 4 children while continuing to serve Victoria. After Victoria's death, Beatrice maintained many of her mother's habits and standards, perpetuating Victorian values and approaches well into the 20th century. She died in 1944 at age 87, having outlived all her siblings and witnessed enormous social changes that she largely observed from a distance, never having fully developed independent life separate from her identity as Victoria's devoted daughter. Her experience illustrates how family dynamics and expectations can create patterns of dependency that, while perhaps not recognized as problematic during their time, substantially limit individual development and create lives organized around others' needs rather than one's own possibilities and potential. Number 25. King James I of England. The unsteady king. King James I of England and VI of Scotland, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, lived during a period when alcohol consumption was widespread and heavy drinking was common among all social classes. Born in 1566 as the son of Mary Queen of Scots, James united the English and Scottish crowns and ruled during a transformative period of British history. Contemporary accounts of his personal habits reveal someone whose relationship with alcohol was notable even by the permissive standards of Stuart England. Historical records from courtiers and foreign ambassadors describe James as drinking heavily and frequently, beginning early in the day and continuing through evening. While heavy drinking was common among Jacobean aristocracy, multiple sources comment specifically on James's consumption, suggesting it was remarkable enough to note even within a culture where such behavior was typical. The king would sometimes appear affected by drink during official functions, behavior that concerned advisors worried about the impression made on foreign dignitaries and domestic political figures. James's court was known for its informality and heavy drinking culture, quite different from the more restrained atmosphere of Elizabeth I's final years. The king encouraged convivial gatherings where alcohol flowed freely, and behavior became increasingly relaxed as evenings progressed. This atmosphere reflected James's personality and preferences, but it also created an environment where excessive consumption was normalized and even expected, making it difficult to distinguish where social drinking ended and more problematic patterns began. Contemporary observers also noted James's physical ungainliness and health problems, some of which may have been worsened by his drinking habits. He suffered from various ailments throughout his reign, and his physical condition deteriorated noticeably as he aged. Whether alcohol contributed significantly to these health issues, or whether they stemmed from other causes, cannot be determined with certainty from historical sources, though the connection between heavy drinking and declining health would have been observed even if not fully understood in medical terms. The political and religious complexities of James's reign, including conflicts with Parliament, religious tensions, and the gunpowder plot, created enormous pressures that may have contributed to his drinking patterns. Ruling over recently united kingdoms with different traditions, managing religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, and navigating the emerging tensions between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority would have been stressful for any monarch. Whether James drank to cope with these pressures, or whether his drinking existed independently of them, represents another question historical sources cannot definitively answer. James died in March 1625 at age 58, after a reign that saw both significant achievements and considerable controversy. His son Charles inherited the throne and the political tensions that would eventually lead to civil war. James's relationship with alcohol reflected both his personal habits and the broader drinking culture of Stuart England, making it difficult to assess how much his consumption differed from typical aristocratic behaviour of his era versus representing more problematic patterns. His life illustrates the challenges of evaluating historical figures' habits when those habits existed within cultural contexts quite different from modern understanding, and when the available sources provide observation but limited insight into the subjective experience or motivation behind documented behaviours. Number 26. Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex, Work and Identity. Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex and youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II, born in 1964, pursued a path notably different from his older siblings by attempting to establish a career in television production rather than focusing primarily on royal duties. His relationship with work during this period of his life revealed patterns of someone seeking identity and purpose outside traditional royal frameworks, though the venture ultimately proved unsustainable given the inherent conflicts between commercial enterprise and royal status. Edward's decision to leave the Royal Marines after beginning officer training surprised many observers and created a difficult situation for both him and his family. Rather than pursuing military or traditional royal paths, he chose to work in theatre and later television production, forming his own company, Ardent Productions. This represented a genuine attempt to establish professional identity separate from his royal birth, though the circumstances made true independence essentially impossible to achieve. His work with Ardent Productions consumed considerable time and energy during the 1990s and early 2000s. Edward approached the business seriously, involving himself in production decisions and attempting to create commercially viable content. However, the company faced persistent questions about whether its success depended on Edward's royal connections rather than the quality of its work, creating uncomfortable dynamics that undermined the very independence he sought to establish through commercial activity. The tension between Edward's royal status and his business activities became increasingly problematic. Incidents where Ardent Productions' work intersected with royal events or family members created controversy and accusations that Edward was exploiting his position for commercial gain. These situations were often awkward and sometimes genuinely inappropriate, revealing the fundamental incompatibility between being a working royal and running a private business that might benefit from royal access. Edward's eventual decision to close Ardent Productions in 2002 and focus on full-time royal duties represented acknowledgement that the experiment in combining commercial work with royal status hadn't succeeded. The transition appeared to be a relief for both Edward and the broader royal family, resolving tensions that had persisted for years and allowing Edward to focus on a role that, while perhaps less exciting than he'd hoped, was at least clearly defined and free from conflicts of interest. His subsequent royal work has been characterised by steady, reliable service in areas including the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, which he inherited after his father's death. Edward has approached these duties with dedication and has gradually established a role within the family that works within, rather than against his royal status. His marriage to Sophie Rhys-Jones has been stable and low profile, with both working as a team to fulfill their royal obligations. Edward's experience illustrates the challenges faced by younger royals trying to establish identity and purpose when traditional paths don't appeal and when attempts at independence face inherent contradictions. His years attempting to build a television career represented genuine effort to create meaningful work outside royal constraints, but the effort ultimately demonstrated that being royal creates complications that make truly independent commercial success essentially impossible. His eventual acceptance of full-time royal duties suggests pragmatic recognition of reality rather than fulfillment of original ambitions, though he appears to have made peace with this compromise and found satisfaction in service, even if it wasn't the path he initially chose. Number 27. Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, architecture as anchor, Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, grandson of King George V, was born in 1944 and inherited his father's title unexpectedly, when his older brother William died in a plane crash in 1972. This unexpected succession transformed Richard from someone pursuing a career in architecture into a working royal, required to fulfill ceremonial and official duties. His relationship with architecture throughout this transition and the decades since reveals someone who maintained connection to professional interests as a way of preserving identity separate from royal obligations. Richard trained as an architect before his brother's death, receiving proper education at Cambridge and pursuing the profession seriously, rather than merely dabbling. He worked in architectural practice and developed genuine expertise in the field, approaching it as a career rather than a hobby. This professional background gave Richard knowledge and skills that set him apart from most royals and provided foundation for identity beyond his birth. When William's death thrust Richard into the role of Duke of Gloucester and the attendant royal duties, he faced the challenge of maintaining connection to his architectural interests while fulfilling obligations that would consume most of his time. He chose to maintain involvement with architectural organizations and causes related to building and preservation, using his royal position to support areas he genuinely cared about, rather than accepting patronages merely because they were offered. Richard's approach to his architectural interests has been notably substantive. He brings informed perspective to discussions about building and preservation, engaging with technical details and offering commentary based on actual knowledge rather than merely lending his name and presence. Colleagues in architectural fields report that Richard understands what he's talking about and contributes meaningfully to conversations, rather than requiring careful management to avoid revealing ignorance. His dedication to maintaining this professional identity alongside royal duties suggests that architecture provides more than merely an interest. It represents connection to the person Richard was and planned to become before circumstance redirected his life. The hours he dedicates to architectural causes and organizations, beyond what strict royal duty requires, indicate genuine passion and perhaps need to maintain continuity with his pre-royal duty existence. Richard's marriage to Birgitte van Deurs has been stable and supportive, with both partners working together to fulfill royal obligations while maintaining some private life, separate from constant public engagement. Their children have pursued their own careers while maintaining connections to royal life, suggesting successful navigation of the challenges inherent in being minor royals with opportunities for relative normalcy. His approach to royal duties has been conscientious and reliable. Richard undertakes hundreds of engagements annually, maintaining a work schedule that rivals more senior royals despite his more peripheral position in the family hierarchy. This dedication suggests genuine commitment to service, though his continued emphasis on architectural interests indicates that royal duty alone doesn't fully satisfy his need for meaningful engagement. Richard's life illustrates how professional training and interests developed before royal duties became primary can remain important sources of identity and satisfaction throughout decades of service. His maintenance of architectural expertise and involvement provides continuity with his earlier ambitions and allows him to contribute meaningfully to a field he cares about, creating a more complete sense of purpose than royal duties alone might provide. Number 28. Princess Alexandra, the Honourable Lady Ogilvy, Service as Structure. Princess Alexandra, the Honourable Lady Ogilvy and cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, was born in 1936 and has spent her entire adult life fulfilling royal duties with dedication that has earned respect across decades of service. Her approach to work throughout her long life suggests someone for whom royal duties have provided not just obligation, but structure, purpose, and identity that have sustained her through personal loss and the natural challenges of aging. Alexandra's dedication to royal work has been remarkably consistent throughout her life. She undertakes hundreds of engagements annually, visiting organizations, attending functions, and fulfilling ceremonial roles with reliability that working royals depend upon. Her schedule has remained demanding even as she has aged, suggesting that the work provides something beyond merely fulfilling inherited obligations. Staff members note that Alexandra finds genuine satisfaction in her duties and maintains connections with many of the organizations she patronizes, rather than treating them as interchangeable appearances. Her marriage to Sir Angus Ogilvy in 1963 was seen as a love match, and their decision to decline a title for Angus meant their children would grow up as private citizens rather than royals. This choice reflected Alexandra's desire to give her children more normal lives while she continued her own royal work. The marriage appeared happy and stable, providing personal foundation that supported her public duties for over 4 decades. Angus's death in 2004 affected Alexandra deeply, creating loss that might have led someone else to reduce commitments and retreat into private life. Instead, Alexandra maintained and if anything increased her work schedule, perhaps finding in royal duties distraction from grief and continuation of purpose beyond her personal loss. The structure and demands of her schedule may have provided comfort during a period when private life offered primarily pain and absence. Her continued work well into her 80s demonstrates either remarkable dedication or perhaps reliance on royal duties as essential framework for life and identity. Alexandra has reduced her schedule somewhat in recent years due to age and health considerations, but she continues fulfilling engagements at a level that would be impressive for someone decades younger. This persistence suggests that the work provides meaning and structure that she is reluctant to relinquish, even when practical considerations might suggest stepping back. Alexandra's approach to royal duties has been notably gracious and warm. She engages genuinely with people she meets during engagements, remembered by many for taking time to have actual conversations rather than merely moving through receiving lines with practiced efficiency. This personal touch has made her popular among the organizations she patronizes and has contributed to her positive reputation throughout her decades of service. Her relationship with the Queen was apparently close and affectionate throughout their lives, with Alexandra being among the few people with whom Elizabeth could truly relax. This personal connection provided emotional support alongside their professional relationship as working royals. Alexandra's life illustrates how royal duties can become not merely obligations to fulfill, but structures that provide purpose, identity, and continuity throughout long lives marked by personal losses and changing circumstances. Her dedication suggests that service, particularly when approached with genuine engagement and commitment, can offer satisfaction and meaning that sustains individuals through challenges that might otherwise prove overwhelming. Number 29. Prince William of Gloucester, Risk and the Need for Speed. Prince William of Gloucester, grandson of King George V, lived from 1941 to 1972 and developed a passion for flying that ultimately cost him his life. His relationship with aviation went beyond casual interest or hobby, revealing patterns of someone drawn to risk, speed, and the intense focus that piloting demanded. His tragic death in a plane crash at age 30 left questions about what kind of life he might have led had he survived. William's decision to pursue actual work rather than merely ceremonial royal duties demonstrated independence and desire for meaningful purpose. He worked in banking and diplomatic service in Nigeria and Tokyo, establishing career and identity separate from his royal status. Colleagues reported that he was capable and hard-working, earning respect through competence rather than coasting on his title. This professional engagement suggested someone uncomfortable with purely decorative existence. His passion for flying represented something different from his professional work. William learned to pilot aircraft and participated in air races, finding in aviation a combination of skill, danger, and freedom that his ground-bound life apparently couldn't provide. The flying wasn't transportation or casual recreation. It was pursuit of experiences that involved risk and required complete presence and focus. Friends noted that William seemed most alive when discussing flying or preparing for races. The risks inherent in air racing were substantial and well understood. Aircraft were pushed to their limits. Pilots competed aggressively, and accidents were not uncommon. William's family worried about his flying, recognizing the dangers he was accepting in pursuit of his passion. Yet, he continued participating, suggesting that whatever satisfaction he derived from flying outweighed the acknowledged risks, or that he simply didn't fully internalize the possibility of catastrophic consequences. His romantic life was complicated by his royal position. William fell in love with Zsuzsi Starkloff, a Hungarian model and divorcee, and their relationship lasted several years. However, William's position in the line of succession and his father's opposition meant that marriage was essentially impossible. William agonized over the choice between love and duty, ultimately choosing duty, though the decision caused him considerable pain. This sacrifice may have contributed to his need for outlets like flying that provided intensity and meaning his constrained personal life couldn't offer. William's death occurred during an air race at an air show in Staffordshire in August 1972. His plane went into a steep dive shortly after takeoff and hit the ground, killing William and his co-pilot instantly. Investigations suggested either pilot error or mechanical failure, but the exact cause was never definitively established. William was 30 years old, handsome, accomplished, and just beginning to find his place in the world when his life ended abruptly. His death devastated his family and fundamentally altered his younger brother Richard's life, transforming Richard from spare to principal overnight and requiring him to abandon his architectural career for royal duties. William's story illustrates how pursuit of intense experiences, particularly those involving significant risk, can reflect needs for meaning, control, and aliveness that constrained circumstances don't provide. Whether his flying represented healthy passion or reflected deeper struggles with his limited options as a minor royal remains a question his early death prevents from being fully answered. Number 30. Princess Mary, daughter of George V, duty and distance. Princess Mary, the only daughter of King George V and Queen Mary, lived from 1897 to 1965 and spent much of her adult life in Yorkshire after her marriage to Viscount Lascelles, later Earl of Harewood. Her approach to royal duties and personal life revealed patterns of someone deeply committed to obligation and service, maintaining rigorous standards and schedules that structured her existence and provided purpose that personal relationships apparently didn't fully offer. Mary's dedication to nursing and medical work began during World War I, when she actually performed nursing duties rather than merely supervising or making ceremonial visits. She continued this interest throughout her life, maintaining patronage of numerous hospitals and nursing organizations with genuine engagement rather than nominal involvement. Her knowledge of medical matters was substantial, earned through actual experience and continued learning rather than merely receiving briefings from staff before official visits. Her marriage to Viscount Lascelles in 1922 was reportedly not a love match, but rather a suitable arrangement between aristocratic families. Lascelles was 15 years older and the marriage produced 2 sons, but apparently little passion or deep emotional connection. Mary fulfilled her wifely duties and maintained appropriate public image, but those close to the family suggested she found limited personal happiness in the relationship. This emotional distance may have contributed to her focus on work and duties as sources of meaning and satisfaction. Mary's daily routine was remarkably structured and consistent. She maintained precise schedules for meals, correspondence, estate management, and charitable work. This routine provided stability and purpose, filling hours with productive activity rather than idle leisure. Staff members could practically set clocks by her movements, as she adhered to her schedule with discipline inherited from her parents' rigid Victorian court. The structure appeared essential to her sense of order and control. Her work schedule was intensive and sustained throughout her adult life. Mary completed numerous royal engagements annually, particularly in Yorkshire, where she became genuinely identified with the region. She supported local causes and attended regional events with frequency that demonstrated real commitment rather than obligatory duty. This dedication earned her affection and respect in Yorkshire, where she became a beloved figure known for accessibility and genuine interest in local matters. Mary's relationship with her brothers varied in closeness. She was particularly close to George VI, perhaps because they shared similar temperaments. Dutiful, somewhat reserved, uncomfortable with spotlight. With David, later Edward VIII, she maintained cordial relations, though she disapproved of his abdication. Her youngest brother John died when she was young, and she apparently retained affectionate memories of him despite his isolation from the family. Her later years continued the patterns established earlier in life. Mary maintained her structured routine and committed approach to duties until health issues forced some reduction in activities. She died in 1965 at age 67, having been the last surviving child of George V. Her funeral reflected both her royal status and her Yorkshire identity, with representation from London and the local community she'd served for decades. Mary's life illustrates how duty and structure can become defining elements of existence, providing purpose and identity, particularly for individuals whose personal lives offer limited emotional satisfaction. Her dedication to service was admirable, though it may have partly reflected need to fill spaces that happier personal circumstances might have occupied with different content. Number 31. Prince John of the United Kingdom, the Forgotten Prince. Prince John, youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, lived from 1895 to 1919 and spent most of his short life separated from his family at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. His story represents not his own compulsions or addictions, but rather his family's approach to disability and difference in the early 20th century, revealing patterns of isolation and separation that modern understanding recognizes as damaging, but that his family believed represented protection and appropriate care. John was born seemingly healthy, but by age 4 began experiencing seizures eventually diagnosed as epilepsy. In that era, epilepsy carried enormous stigma, with families particularly concerned that such conditions suggested problematic heredity. George and Mary made the difficult decision to keep John increasingly separate from public life and eventually from most family contact, believing this protected both him from unkind scrutiny and the monarchy from embarrassment about his condition. He was moved to Wood Farm with his devoted nanny, Charlotte Lala Bill, who provided the consistent care and affection that circumstances allowed. This wasn't imprisonment in the harsh sense, as the estate provided space for John to roam and gardens where he could play. However, it was isolation nonetheless, separating a child from his siblings and parents for reasons he likely couldn't fully understand. John was being hidden because his condition embarrassed the family and because his unpredictable seizures made public appearances impossible. Reports from those who knew John suggest he was sweet-natured and loved animals and nature. He kept pets including rabbits and chickens, spending hours in the gardens and developing relationships with the staff who cared for him. He had some education from tutors, though learning disabilities made traditional academics challenging. Instead, he learned practical skills and enjoyed simple pleasures, creating life within the limitations his conditions and circumstances imposed. John's seizures grew more frequent and severe as he aged. Treatment options in that era were limited and often barbaric by modern standards. He was given medications that had sedating effects but didn't prevent seizures and had numerous side effects. The condition was poorly understood, and families like his could do little beyond keeping the child comfortable and safe from injury during episodes. His siblings visited when possible, though their memories of John were vague given age differences and the separation. Mary, his sister, later wrote affectionately about him, remembering a gentle brother who seemed content despite limitations. Whether John understood his isolation or questioned why his family lived elsewhere while he remained at Wood Farm cannot be known. The inner experience of a child with epilepsy and possible developmental disabilities, separated from family and living in relative isolation, remains inaccessible to historical inquiry. John died during a severe seizure in January 1919, shortly after his 13th birthday. His death was reported matter-of-factly in court circulars without public funeral. Queen Mary wrote in her diary that his death was a great relief because he had become more of an anxiety than ever. This wasn't callousness, but reflected exhaustion of caring for a severely disabled child with limited resources and the belief that death freed John from a life of suffering. His grave at Sandringham is simple and understated, reflecting the quiet life he led. Modern perspectives on disability make John's story particularly poignant. With current understanding and treatment of epilepsy, he might have lived very differently. Instead, he remains a footnote in royal history, a reminder of how families once responded to conditions they couldn't understand or accept. Choosing isolation over integration and viewing difference as embarrassment requiring concealment rather than condition requiring accommodation and support. Number 32. Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, the Grand Old Duke. Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, second son of King George III, lived from 1763 to 1827 and became immortalised, somewhat mockingly, in the nursery rhyme about the Grand Old Duke of York, who marched his men up and down hills. Beyond his mixed military career, Frederick's personal life was marked by patterns of excess that created recurring problems throughout his adult years, particularly regarding spending and lifestyle choices that his income, however substantial, could never quite support. Frederick's lifestyle was extravagant in ways that went beyond typical royal excess. He maintained multiple residences, employed enormous household staff, and spent lavishly on entertaining, furnishings, and personal pleasures. His taste for luxury wasn't merely aristocratic preference, but compulsive spending that seemed disconnected from any consideration of actual resources or consequences. Bills accumulated constantly, creditors multiplied, and financial crises became recurring features of his existence. His relationship with Mary Ann Clark, an actress and courtesan, resulted in major scandal when it emerged that Clark had been selling military commissions and promotions, using her influence with Frederick to profit from appointments. Frederick claimed ignorance of this arrangement, but the scandal forced his temporary resignation as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. The episode damaged his reputation permanently and illustrated how his personal choices created vulnerabilities that others could exploit for their own purposes. The pattern of Frederick's life involves cycles of accumulating debt, requiring parliamentary bailout, promising reform, and then returning to the same spending patterns within months. Each financial rescue came with lectures about responsibility and expectations of changed behaviour, yet Frederick seemed unable to sustain any meaningful alteration in his approach to money. This cycle suggested compulsive aspects to his spending, rather than merely poor judgment that could be corrected through advice or consequences. His military reforms, implemented during his time as Commander-in-Chief, were genuinely valuable and modernised important aspects of army organisation. Frederick possessed real administrative ability and understanding of military needs, yet his personal scandals and financial chaos undermined these legitimate accomplishments, creating a situation where his contributions were overshadowed by his failures and leaving legacy that mixed genuine achievement with substantial embarrassment. Frederick died in 1827 at age 63, still heavily in debt despite lifetime of royal income. His lack of legitimate heirs meant his titles became extinct at his death. The succession implications of his childless state contributed to the eventual circumstances that brought Queen Victoria to the throne. Frederick's life serves as example of how patterns of spending and lifestyle choices can become compulsive, resistant to change despite repeated consequences and interventions. His story illustrates that awareness of problems and genuine desire to reform don't automatically translate into sustained behavioral change, particularly when underlying patterns reflect deeper issues than merely poor money management or lack of discipline. Number 33. Princess Charlotte of Wales, Promise Unfulfilled. Princess Charlotte of Wales, daughter of the Prince Regent who became King George IV, lived from 1796 to 1817 and was for most of her short life heir presumptive to the British throne. Her personal habits and characteristics reveal someone whose spirited personality and independence created tensions with expectations of her position, though her tragic early death prevents full understanding of how these patterns might have developed had she lived to inherit the crown. Charlotte's relationship with both parents was difficult and complicated by their bitter estrangement. Her father was self-indulgent and negligent, more concerned with his own pleasures than effective parenting. Her mother, Caroline, was erratic and sometimes inappropriate, creating scandals that embarrassed Charlotte and complicated her position. Charlotte navigated between them carefully, attempting to maintain relationships with both while avoiding being used as weapon in their battles, a situation that created stress and emotional challenges throughout her youth. Her appetite for food was notable from adolescence, with contemporary accounts describing someone who ate heartily and with enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded what was considered appropriate for young women of her station. While not reaching the extremes of her father's consumption, Charlotte's approach to food suggested someone who took substantial pleasure in eating and didn't always exercise restraint expected of her. This pattern may have reflected emotional eating in response to the stresses of her difficult family situation. Charlotte's engagement to Prince William of Orange was arranged for political purposes, and she initially accepted it. However, she later broke the engagement, refusing to leave England if marriage meant living permanently in the Netherlands. This demonstrated remarkable independence for a princess of her era, asserting personal will against political expectations. Her refusal caused diplomatic difficulty, but established that she wouldn't be simply forced into arrangements she found unacceptable, revealing strength of character and determination to maintain some control over her own life. Her eventual marriage to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld appears to have been genuinely affectionate. They shared interests and temperaments, and Leopold provided stability and support that Charlotte had lacked in her turbulent childhood. Their marriage was brief, but apparently happy, providing Charlotte with first real experience of stable, loving relationship, and suggesting that her future reign might have benefited from this personal foundation. Charlotte's pregnancy in 1817 was cause for national celebration, with the nation eagerly anticipating birth of future monarch. However, the delivery went tragically wrong. After prolonged and difficult labour lasting over 50 hours, Charlotte delivered a stillborn son. She seemed to recover initially, but suffered complications, likely postpartum hemorrhage, and died hours after the birth at age 21. Her death shocked the nation into genuine mourning and changed British history fundamentally. She had been popular, representing hope for more stable monarchy after scandals of her father's generation. Her death triggered the rush by her father's brothers to marry and produce heirs that eventually resulted in Victoria's birth and accession, altering the entire course of the 19th century. Number 34. Prince Charles Edward, Duke of Albany, a royal court between nations. Prince Charles Edward, Duke of Albany and later Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was grandson of Queen Victoria through her youngest son Leopold. Born in 1884 after his father's death, he inherited British titles at birth, but was selected at age 15 to inherit the German duchy when the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha line faced extinction without heirs. This decision removed him from Britain and placed him in circumstances that would create profound conflicts of loyalty during 2 world wars. Charles Edward's transition from British prince to German duke was gradual but thorough. He adopted German language, customs, and perspectives, eventually identifying more strongly with his adopted country than his birth nation. During World War I, he served in the German military, fulfilling obligations to the country where he had lived and ruled for years. This decision was legally and practically understandable, given his position as a German duke, but it resulted in the British government stripping him of his British titles and honours, severing his official connections to his birth country. His involvement with political movements in Germany during the 1930s represents the most controversial and historically significant aspect of his later life. Historical records document his participation in the political system of that era, though historians continue to debate his motivations, the extent of his ideological commitment, and whether his actions reflected genuine belief or attempts to protect his position and properties during a dangerous period. These choices, whatever their underlying reasons, had lasting consequences for his reputation and relationships. Charles Edward's personal life included a stable marriage to Princess Victoria Adelaide of Schleswig-Holstein. They had 5 children and maintained their relationship despite the political difficulties surrounding them. After World War II, both faced social isolation and financial hardship as consequences of Charles Edward's political associations and wartime positions. His final years were marked by reduced circumstances and social ostracism. Allied occupation forces interned him. He underwent legal proceedings related to his wartime activities, and he lost significant property and resources. The British royal family maintained complete distance, and his former social circles largely rejected him. He died in 1954 at age 69, having become a historical figure whose earlier royal status was overshadowed by his controversial political choices. Charles Edward's life illustrates the complex situations that can arise when individuals hold positions in multiple countries during periods of international conflict. Born British but ruling in Germany, he faced choices about loyalty and identity that had no simple or clearly correct answers. His decisions during the World Wars and the political turmoil of the 1930s placed him in historical circumstances where any choice involved betraying some obligation or relationship. Modern historical assessment of his life continues, with scholars examining the evidence and context of his actions while recognizing that his story reflects broader questions about nationality, loyalty, and the responsibilities of those born into positions of privilege during turbulent historical periods. Number 35. Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria, work without rest. Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria, lived from 1819 to 1861 and demonstrated a relationship with work that those around him recognized as compulsive and ultimately damaging to his health. Born into German nobility and marrying Victoria in 1840, Albert faced defining a role for himself in a country that initially viewed him as foreign interloper. His response was to throw himself into work with intensity that never diminished throughout his 21 years as Victoria's husband. Albert's daily routine was rigorously structured around productivity. He rose early and worked through correspondence before breakfast, believing idleness was morally wrong. He structured every hour around useful activity, whether governmental work, managing estates, planning projects, or pursuing intellectual interests. This compulsive productivity stemmed partly from his upbringing and partly from his need to prove his worth in his adopted country. His role in planning the Great Exhibition of 1851 represented his greatest achievement, but revealed the toll his work habits took. Albert personally oversaw countless details, from selecting locations to approving design elements of the Crystal Palace. He worked obsessively for years, often late into the night, driving himself beyond what his constitution could sustain. The exhibition's success vindicated his efforts, but the stress contributed to physical decline he never recovered from. Albert's approach to parenting emphasized education and discipline, creating rigorous study schedules, particularly for the Prince of Wales. He became frustrated when his son failed to meet expectations, unable to understand why the boy didn't share his intellectual passions. This pressure damaged their relationship, and contributed to Bertie's later rebellious behaviour. Albert couldn't comprehend leisure or accept that others might have different needs regarding work and rest. His various projects demonstrated genuine vision and achievement. Albert promoted arts and sciences, advocated for reforms, modernised royal estates, and involved himself in countless causes. However, the breadth of his commitment suggested difficulty setting priorities or accepting limitations. He appeared driven to prove himself constantly, unable to rest or feel he had done enough to justify his position. Albert's final illness in 1861, diagnosed as typhoid fever, struck a body already weakened by years of overwork and chronic health problems. His physicians had warned him repeatedly about his pace and stress levels, but Albert dismissed their concerns, believing duty and productivity outweighed personal health considerations. When typhoid struck, his weakened constitution couldn't fight the infection effectively. He died in December 1861 at age 42, leaving Victoria devastated and Britain without the consort who had modernised so many aspects of national life. Albert's early death robbed Britain of continued contributions and condemned Victoria to 40 years of mourning. His life illustrates how work can become compulsion that provides meaning and identity, but ultimately consumes the person, particularly when driven by needs to prove worth that can never be fully satisfied regardless of accomplishments achieved. And so, our journey through the hidden struggles of Britain's royal family comes to a close. From King George IV's overwhelming excesses to Prince Albert's relentless work that consumed him, from Princess Margaret's cigarettes and spirits to Queen Victoria's decades-long mourning, we've explored 35 royals whose private battles with dependency, compulsion, and obsession reveal the deeply human faces behind the crowns and titles. These stories remind us that privilege and power provide no immunity from the struggles that can affect anyone. Behind palace walls and away from public ceremonies, these royals face the same vulnerabilities that touch all human lives: the need to cope with pain, the search for meaning and purpose, the difficulty of maintaining control when patterns become compulsive, and the challenge of finding balance in lives that offered either too much freedom or too many constraints. Some found ways to manage their struggles. Others were consumed by them. Many simply endured, carrying their dependencies and obsessions through decades of royal duty, finding what comfort they could in the very habits that sometimes harmed them. Thank you for joining this quiet exploration. If you enjoyed these stories, please like this video and subscribe for more whispered journeys into history. As you drift towards sleep, may the hidden corridors, secret letters, and private gardens of the palace guide your dreams, and may your own hidden self know it is worthy of care and compassion. Good night.